Here is William Hogarth, 18th century British artist. If you want a sense of what an innovative, even revolutionary artist Hogarth was, you want to think of him primarily not as a painter or a portraiturist or a book illustrator, but rather as the inventor of the modern graphic novel. This is his shortest and first sequence, the 1725 before and after. There's a whole world to read in the facial expressions and gestures of each of the characters in each of the prints. In the after, the man is buttoning his pants almost as fast as he unbuttoned them in the before painting. Now, with his mouth agape, he's clearly heading for the door. For him, it's a bit like Shakespeare's Sonnet 129, but in graphic form. Had, having, and in quest to have extreme, a bliss in proof and proved a very woe. For her, it's something quite different, as she holds desperately and vainly to one remaining hope after she's just lost so much. It's a short story in 2 images, and the young woman's story is just beginning. Here's the fella's face from Hogarth's immensely popular print version. Hogarth couldn't stand hypocrisy or inconstancy, and over time came to cherish his power to eviscerate the cruel with a metal stylus moved in slow, deliberate lines. In 1732, Hogarth published the series that would change his life and our world forever. In just 6 plates, A Harlot's Progress tells the story of a young woman coming to London with the greatest of hopes and winding up in a crushing world of prostitution, disease, and early death. It is perhaps the earliest graphic novel. It is also a key moment in the convergence of fine art and popular art, for the sale of thousands of engravings enabled Hogarth to become a wealthy man, not for selling single paintings to be hung up in the home of royalty or the very rich, but for the sale of prints to be owned and cherished and seen by thousands. The first print introduces us to Moll Hackabout, perhaps 19 years old at the very moment of her arrival in London from rural Kent with all the world before her. Alone in the city, immensely hopeful but perhaps a bit afraid, Moll is glad for the warmth and touch upon her face of the kind woman who, smiling, reaches towards her. She has no idea that this woman runs a brothel, is in current terms a sex trafficker intent on exploiting Moll as the new arrival for her own gain until she has literally used Moll up. The second plate shows Moll as a mistress or courtesan to a wealthy man as she creates a diversion so another lover or customer can escape. The third plate shows Moll having come down in the world, now in a reduced garret, languishing, unaware that bailiffs' sporting clubs have entered her lodging to take her away to prison. And the fourth plate shows Moll in Bridewell prison with the laborious task of beating flax with a large hammer all day long. To the right are other prisoners who have escaped the hard labor by satisfying the prison administration with special favors. And the fifth plate shows Moll dying of syphilis with harm rather than help from the 2 doctors, each hawking their particular nostrums with claims that it will cure her. Here, folly, doctor-like controlling skill. Can you imagine placing your medical care in the hands of those 2 pompous fops? Finally, in the 6th engraving, Moll has disappeared from view entirely. Instead, we see the coffin in which she lies dead. The note describes her as M. Hackabout, died age 23, September 2nd, 1731. And the mourners hardly seem to care about her at all. They're all drunk or distracted with their amorous play or guzzling gin, removing Moll's jewelry. Her child, dressed in black, already shows the signs of syphilitic infection, presumably passed on from his mother, and there are hundreds of small details in each Hogarth print that make immersing oneself in the narrative more interesting. One striking example here is the hat hanging by the coat of arms is the one Moll wore when she arrived in London so full of hope not very long ago. In my end is my beginning. Perhaps the most interesting figure in the sense of narratives extending forward through time is the woman on the left who spends her time sitting by the coffin giving flirtatious glances as she stares directly at the viewer of the print, suggesting yet another cycle of exploitive economics, a fun frolic of destructive erotics, but this time around including the viewer of the print. People who have never even heard of Hogarth still know the iconic plunging baby image at the center of his 1751 Gin Lane. It's one of the most iconic horror images of all time, right up there with Goya's Saturn devouring his child and Edvard Munch's The Scream. It sticks because it hits us on every level, embodying multiple horrors in a single image. We identify with the infant. He's one figure midst perhaps 100 looking right at us, even midst Hogarth's hell broth of gin-nurtured horrors. Imagine nursing as a world of calm, a bonding, an infusion of warmth and safety and life from mother to child, but at the very moment of maximum imagined vulnerability, we're torn away, inverted, and plunging toward a bloody death. It's like Lady Macbeth's, "I have given suck and know how tender 'tis to nurse the babe that milks me. I would, while it were smiling in my face, have plucked my nipples from its boneless gums and dashed the brains out." The inversion is troubling too. Everyone in this zombie world, besides coffin warehouses and pawn shops and gin mills, is falling down, falling down, falling down. And in this hell broth of horrors, it's not just the baby facing doom. For a clue as to why Gin Alley seems so urgently modern these days, let's talk about the gin in Gin Lane. Gin had been a respectable and tasty Dutch drink named Genever, made chiefly from the juniper berry. When it migrated to England, boosted by reports of Dutch courage when English soldiers observed gin-nurtured, fearless Dutch fighters, completely unregulated and untaxed until 1729, it quickly was manufactured by 1,000 tiny British distilleries, where gin devolved into a catch-all spirit where cheapest manufacture was the order of the day. That meant rancid grains, floor sweepings, and the rodentia droppings that went along with it. There are contemporary reports of turpentine, sulfuric acid, lead, and methanol from incomplete distilling that made its way into the cheap and toxic brew. The desperately poor might not be able to afford housing or anything but rags for clothing and food, but they could afford gin, and this resulting world of mayhem, desperation, and depravity strikes closer to home now than it did in previous decades. Gin, in the sense of dead drunk for 2 pence, isn't the gin we think of now, so drunk for a penny, dead drunk for 2 takes on more sinister tone. The dark door, the most solid, flat, and consistently cross-hatched surface on the print, or all of Hogarth for that matter. Think of the most end-of-the-road opium den in the 19th century, or the most end-of-the-line crack, meth, fentanyl, or trank house these days, and you might come close. Only factor in the straw, the vomit, the rot, the rats, and you realize why Hogarth kept the dead drunk for 2 pence door closed tight. It is like the geek's foul pen of Nightmare Alley, open to all for a penny. The sorrows of gin in the 18th century were immense, and it was always an endgame. At the end of his life, when his body was failing, Hogarth did one final work called Tailpiece. It's a kind of elegy and visual testament of what happens when we don't feed what is beautiful and what is truly important. Hogarth had spent decades seeing what sometimes festers beneath artifice and beneath pretense, of seeing the skull beneath the skin, of seeing the syphilitic contagion, not only of the disease, but of malice and of human folly. And the novelist in Hogarth was always looking beyond the captured moment, the first causes and the final outcomes. His novelist eyes that see a single act of folly or cruelty compounded over time to mayhem and grief, and that awful daring of a moment's surrender which an age of prudence can never retract. And so at the end of his life, as his body was failing and spirits were crushed, Hogarth created a grim elegiacal final work. It's Ecclesiastes without hope of any redemption, or ever the silver cord be broken, or the golden bowl be broken, the pitcher be broken at the fountain, or the wheel broken at the cistern. Then shall the dust return as it was. It is the end of all things, the shattered hourglass, the cracked bell, the ship wrecked, the gibbet falling. It is the end of the world. The best commentary on Hogarth's final image isn't to be found in a book by Paulson or Unger or any of Hogarth's brilliant commentators. It is Johnny Cash's end-of-the-life recasting of Trent Reznor's stunning song Hurt. Hurt and William Hogarth's final work have been fused in my mind for decades. Copyright restrictions won't let me give you Johnny Cash, so it's silence or me. So, with apologies, here is Hogarth's End of the World looking back, and remember everything. What have I become? My sweetest friend. Everyone I know goes away in the end. You could have it all, my empire of dirt. I will let you down. I will make you hurt. If I could start again 1,000,000 miles away, I would keep myself, I would find a way. Thank you for watching William Hogarth.